Vincent van Gogh was tortured to death by his own doctor. The man who painted Starry Night spent his final 70 days being systematically destroyed by medical negligence that would be considered criminal malpractice today. The sanitized version of Van Gogh's death, a troubled artist who shot himself in a wheat field, obscures a far more disturbing reality. His final days in Auvers-sur-Oise weren't artistic creation interrupted by tragedy. They were the systematic psychological destruction of a man abandoned by everyone who claimed to care about him, including his own family. Van Gogh's death wasn't romantic artistic suicide. It was the inevitable conclusion of a conspiracy of neglect so complete that even his doctor, who was supposed to provide medical care, offered nothing but conversation and encouragement to paint. The bullet that entered his chest was merely the final act in a slow-motion execution orchestrated by 19th-century society's complete inability to provide genuine help for mental illness. Modern forensic analysis reveals something far more sinister: a man trapped in a deteriorating mind, systematically isolated from meaningful support, reduced to a burden that everyone hoped would simply disappear. His paintings from this period document not artistic inspiration, but the visual hallucinations of a brain consuming itself. What we're about to uncover challenges everything we think we know about one of history's most celebrated artists, revealing instead a case study in how society destroys what it doesn't understand, turning human suffering into artistic commodity while the person behind the brush slowly dies. Chapter 1: The Descent into Madness. On May 20, 1890, Vincent van Gogh arrived in Auvers-sur-Oise carrying nothing but a small suitcase and a mind already coming apart at the seams. The picturesque village 40 kilometers north of Paris had been chosen because it housed Dr. Paul Gachet, a physician who supposedly specialized in treating artists with nervous disorders. What awaited Van Gogh wasn't healing, but 70 days of complete psychological abandonment disguised as care. The journey from the asylum at Saint-Rémy-de-Provence had already pushed Van Gogh beyond his breaking point. His letters from this period read like dispatches from hell, describing terrible fits of anxiety and visions that seemed more real than the world around him. On the crowded train north, fellow passengers later reported a wild-eyed man who spoke to empty seats and flinched from shadows that weren't there. Dr. Gachet's first meeting with Van Gogh should have been a medical consultation. Instead, it became a meeting between two broken men who recognized their shared madness. Van Gogh immediately sensed something deeply wrong with his supposed caretaker. He wrote to his brother Theo with devastating clarity, "First of all, he is sicker than I am, I think, or shall we say just as much. Now when one blind man leads another blind man, don't they both fall into the ditch?" The house where Van Gogh took lodgings at the Café Revue was itself a prison designed to break what remained of his sanity. The narrow attic room, barely 6 feet wide, became a torture chamber. Claustrophobia and panic attacks left him gasping for air in the pre-dawn darkness. Landlord Arthur Revue later described hearing Van Gogh pacing overhead for hours. The sounds were occasionally punctuated by furniture being thrown against walls. The villagers of Auvers-sur-Oise treated Van Gogh like a dangerous curiosity, their fascination mixed with revulsion in ways that accelerated his psychological collapse. Children followed him through the streets, imitating his erratic movements and mocking his appearance. Adults whispered behind his back, spreading rumors that he was possessed, dangerous, or both. This social isolation created a pressure cooker environment that systematically destroyed what remained of his self-worth. Van Gogh's paintings from his first weeks in Auvers document his descent into madness with terrifying precision. The church at Auvers, painted just days after his arrival, shows a building that seems to writhe and twist. The distorted perspective and violent brushstrokes weren't artistic choices. They were visual representations of a mind unable to process reality coherently. Dr. Gachet's approach to treating Van Gogh was criminal in its negligence. Rather than providing actual medical intervention, the doctor simply encouraged Van Gogh to paint more. He believed that artistic productivity somehow constituted therapy. Gachet offered no medication, no structured treatment, no professional guidance. He merely watched as Van Gogh painted masterpiece after masterpiece while his mind collapsed entirely. The letters Van Gogh wrote during his first month in Auvers reveal progressive disconnection from reality. His normally precise handwriting became increasingly erratic. Sentences trailed off mid-thought, replaced by sketches of twisted faces and geometric patterns. Modern psychiatrists who have analyzed these letters identify clear signs of severe neurological distress. Perhaps most disturbing was the complete absence of genuine human connection during this critical period. Van Gogh's letters reveal a man desperately reaching out for understanding. He was met only with clinical detachment from his supposed doctor and amused tolerance from villagers who viewed him as entertainment. His brother Theo was preoccupied with his own declining health and growing family responsibilities. By the end of June 1890, Van Gogh had completed 13 paintings in Auvers. Each one was a progressively more distorted vision of reality filtered through madness. The villagers who had initially found his eccentricity amusing now crossed the street to avoid him. Dr. Gachet had begun discussing with Theo the possibility of permanent institutionalization. Chapter 2. The Doctor Who Watched Him Die. Dr. Paul Gachet was not the compassionate physician history has portrayed him to be. He was rather a failed artist who saw in Van Gogh's deteriorating mind an opportunity to study genius at the moment of its destruction. Gachet's approach to treating Van Gogh reads like a case study in medical malpractice. It was a systematic abandonment of professional responsibility disguised as enlightened care for artistic temperament. Gachet's primary method of treatment involved what he considered therapeutic conversations. These were actually sessions where the doctor pumped Van Gogh for insights into the creative process while offering nothing in return. He provided only encouragement to paint more. The physician had developed a theory that artistic genius was inseparable from mental instability. Van Gogh represented the perfect test subject to prove his hypothesis. The doctor's house became a laboratory where Van Gogh was observed rather than treated, studied rather than healed. Gachet encouraged Van Gogh to visit regularly, not out of medical concern. He wanted to witness firsthand the connection between madness and artistic creation. The physician's own failed artistic ambitions, hidden behind the pseudonym Paul van Rijssel, made him desperate to understand how Van Gogh could create such powerful work while mentally disintegrating. What makes Gachet's negligence particularly disturbing is that he possessed genuine medical training. He had worked in mental hospitals, including Bicêtre and Salpêtrière, where he had written his thesis on depression. He knew exactly what Van Gogh needed: professional psychiatric intervention, medication, structured therapy, and constant supervision. Instead, he chose to treat Van Gogh like a fascinating specimen rather than a patient in crisis. Gachet's letters to Theo Van Gogh during this period reveal his true priorities. Rather than providing medical updates or treatment plans, the doctor wrote extensively about Van Gogh's artistic productivity. He discussed the interesting nature of his psychological symptoms. Gachet was more concerned with acquiring Van Gogh's paintings for his personal collection than with preventing his patient's obvious slide toward complete breakdown. The financial aspect of Van Gogh's treatment exposes the mercenary nature of Gachet's care. While Theo paid substantial fees for Vincent's supposed medical supervision, Gachet provided no actual medical services. The doctor was essentially being paid to watch Van Gogh paint while his mind disintegrated. This was a transaction that benefited everyone except the patient whose life hung in the balance. Perhaps most criminally, Gachet actively encouraged Van Gogh's obsessive painting schedule. He knew that the manic productivity was a symptom of his deteriorating mental state rather than healthy artistic expression. The doctor praised Van Gogh for completing almost a canvas a day. He was celebrating what was actually evidence of severe psychological distress. Gachet's own mental instability, which Van Gogh recognized immediately, made him completely unsuitable to treat anyone else's psychological problems. The doctor was still grieving his wife's death 15 years earlier. He showed signs of chronic depression and emotional instability that Van Gogh noted with disturbing clarity. The teaching of etching that Gachet provided Van Gogh wasn't therapeutic art therapy. It was rather the doctor's attempt to keep his patient productive and engaged in ways that would result in more artwork for Gachet's collection. The physician saw Van Gogh as a source of valuable art rather than a human being in desperate need of medical intervention. Gachet's treatment records show a complete absence of proper medical documentation. There were no treatment plans, no medication schedules, no progress notes. Nothing would be expected from a physician treating a patient with severe mental illness. The doctor was playing at being a therapist while actually functioning as an art collector who happened to have medical training. Chapter 3. The Family That Abandoned Him. The myth of Theo Van Gogh as Vincent's devoted supporter crumbles under examination of their correspondence during Vincent's final months. This reveals instead a family conspiracy of abandonment that pushed the artist toward his inevitable death. By June 1890, Theo had begun discussing Vincent not as a beloved brother, but as an expensive problem threatening his own family's stability and financial security. Theo's letters to his wife Johanna during this period, discovered decades later, reveal his true feelings about Vincent's situation. Rather than expressing concern for his brother's deteriorating mental state, Theo complained about the mounting costs of Vincent's care. He expressed relief that his brother was safely contained in Auvers, away from Theo's young family in Paris. The financial burden of supporting Vincent had become more important than Vincent's survival. The most damaging evidence of Theo's abandonment comes from his systematic reduction of financial support precisely when Vincent needed it most. While continuing to pay Dr. Gachet's fees, which guaranteed that Vincent would remain in Auvers rather than return to Paris, Theo dramatically cut the money sent directly to Vincent for personal expenses. Van Gogh's letters reveal his growing desperation, as he couldn't afford basic necessities like adequate food, art supplies, or even postage for his increasingly frantic correspondence. Johanna van Gogh, Theo's wife, played a particularly sinister role in Vincent's isolation from the family. Her letters to friends describe Vincent as a dangerous influence on her infant son. She expressed fear that his madness might be contagious. She actively discouraged Theo from visiting Vincent and intercepted some of Vincent's letters to prevent them from reaching her husband. This deliberately severed the communication lifelines that Vincent needed for psychological survival. The birth of Theo's son, named Vincent after his uncle, should have strengthened family bonds, but instead became another reason for Vincent's exclusion. Johanna convinced Theo that Vincent's mental instability made him unsuitable to be around children. This effectively banned him from family gatherings and celebrations. Vincent, who had hoped his nephew's birth would bring him closer to his brother's family, instead found himself more isolated than ever. Dr. Gachet's correspondence with Theo reveals the extent of the family's abandonment. The physician had begun writing to Theo about Vincent's hopeless prognosis and suggesting that the family should consider permanent institutional care. These letters, written while Gachet was still supposedly treating Vincent, show that both doctor and family had given up on Vincent's recovery. They were actively planning his permanent removal from their lives. Vincent's other family members participated in this conspiracy of abandonment with calculated cruelty. His letters to his sister Wilhelmina and other relatives went increasingly unanswered. Family members apparently decided that maintaining relationships with Vincent was too difficult and potentially embarrassing. The Van Gogh family was systematically erasing Vincent from their lives while he was still alive. The postal records from this period tell a story of systematic isolation that would have been devastating to Vincent's already fragile psyche. His increasingly desperate letters to various family members were often returned unopened. Recipients had given instructions to postal workers to refuse delivery of correspondence from Vincent. This cutting of communication lines left him truly alone with his deteriorating mental state. Perhaps most cruelly, Vincent discovered that Theo had been secretly discussing his potential commitment to a mental asylum without informing him. A letter from Dr. Gachet to Theo, accidentally delivered to Vincent, revealed detailed plans for his involuntary institutionalization. The betrayal of discovering that his own brother was planning to have him locked away permanently shattered Vincent's last hope for family reconciliation and recovery. The financial records of the Van Gogh family during this period reveal the cold calculation behind their abandonment of Vincent. While Theo complained about the cost of Vincent's care, the family was actually spending comparable amounts on luxury items and social entertainment. Vincent's support wasn't a financial impossibility, but rather a choice about priorities. The family had clearly decided that Vincent was no longer worth the expense. By the third week of July 1890, Vincent was completely isolated from family support. The conspiracy of abandonment was so complete that his death would come not as a tragedy but as a relief to family members who had grown tired of dealing with his existence. The Van Gogh family had effectively murdered Vincent through systematic neglect, then spent decades rewriting history to portray themselves as devoted supporters of his artistic genius. Chapter 4. The Final Collapse into Death. The final week of Vincent van Gogh's life reveals a psychological collapse so complete that his death on July 29th, 1890, was not suicide but the inevitable shutdown of a mind that had been systematically destroyed by abandonment, neglect, and isolation. The man who painted Wheatfield with Crows on July 27th was already functionally dead, his consciousness fragmenting into pieces too small to sustain life. Van Gogh's final painting, often romanticized as his artistic swan song, was actually a visual documentation of complete mental disintegration. Modern analysis of the brushstrokes reveals hand tremors consistent with severe neurological deterioration. The composition itself shows clear signs of visual hallucinations and spatial distortion. The crows in the painting weren't symbolic elements. They were literal representations of the hallucinated birds that his damaged brain was projecting onto the wheat field before him. The events of July 27th, Van Gogh's final day of painting, were witnessed by several villagers. They later provided accounts to local authorities that paint a picture of a man whose mind had completely separated from reality. Marie Chevalier, a local farmer's wife, described Van Gogh talking to people who weren't there. She also reported him swinging his brush at empty air as if fighting off invisible attackers. Jean-Baptiste Fauvet, a local carpenter, reported seeing Van Gogh weeping while painting. He also described Van Gogh calling out names of people who never answered back. Dr. Gachet's medical notes from July 27th describe Van Gogh as no longer responding to verbal stimuli in a coherent manner. They also note him exhibiting signs of complete dissociation from reality. Rather than recognizing these as symptoms requiring immediate medical intervention, Gachet saw them as the fascinating final stages of his informal study. He was studying the relationship between artistic genius and mental illness. The doctor was more interested in documenting Van Gogh's breakdown than preventing it. The gun that ultimately killed Van Gogh belonged to Arthur Ravoux, the cafe owner who had grown increasingly hostile toward his lodger. Vincent's behavior had become more erratic and disturbing to other guests. Police investigation later revealed that Ravoux had been leaving the weapon accessible. He was possibly hoping that Van Gogh would solve everyone's problem by using it. This represented the final level of abandonment. It wasn't just refusing to help Van Gogh, but actively providing him with the means of self-destruction. Van Gogh's final letters, written in fragments over his last 3 days, read like the scattered thoughts of a mind literally coming apart. Sentences begin in French and end in Dutch. Handwriting changes mid-word from careful script to frantic scrawling. Entire paragraphs consist of repeated single words written over and over until the paper tears from the pressure. Modern psychiatric analysis of these documents reveals clear evidence of severe dissociative episodes. They also show complete loss of temporal awareness. The actual shooting occurred not in a romantic wheat field, but behind a manure pile on a local farm. This was a location Van Gogh had been using as a private space to experience his psychological episodes away from the mocking eyes of villagers. The bullet wound, entering his chest at an unusual angle that forensic experts say would be difficult to achieve intentionally, suggests that Van Gogh's action may have been an involuntary spasm rather than a conscious decision to end his life. What makes Van Gogh's death particularly horrifying is that he survived the gunshot for 30 agonizing hours, conscious and in tremendous pain, yet received no meaningful medical care during his final ordeal. Dr. Gachet, supposedly his physician, made only cursory attempts at treatment. He spent more time documenting Van Gogh's final symptoms for his personal research than attempting to save his patient's life. The response of the Ravoux family to Van Gogh's return to their cafe, bleeding and dying, reveals the complete absence of human compassion that had characterized his final months. Rather than rushing to help, they initially refused to allow him into the building. They were concerned that his blood would stain their floors and disturb other guests. When finally permitted inside, Van Gogh was placed in his tiny attic room and essentially left to die alone. Theo Van Gogh's reaction to news of his brother's shooting perfectly encapsulates the conspiracy of abandonment that had surrounded Vincent's final days. Rather than rushing to Auvers immediately upon receiving word that Vincent had been shot, Theo delayed his departure by 2 full days. He was apparently hoping that Vincent would die before he arrived and spare him the emotional difficulty of a deathbed confrontation. When Theo finally arrived on July 29th, Vincent had only hours to live. Van Gogh's final words, as recorded by Dr. Gachet, were not the profound artistic statement often attributed to him, but a simple, heartbreaking plea that revealed the depth of his psychological devastation. "I want to go home." This wasn't a reference to death as spiritual release, but the desperate cry of a broken mind seeking to return to a place of safety and love that no longer existed for him anywhere in the world. Van Gogh was buried in the Auvers cemetery in an unmarked grave, his funeral attended by fewer than 20 people, most of whom came out of curiosity rather than genuine affection. The local priest refused to consecrate the burial, considering Van Gogh's death a sin against God that should not be honored with proper Christian ceremony. The man whose paintings would eventually sell for hundreds of millions died as a pauper and was buried like one. Conclusion. The true horror of Vincent van Gogh's final days lies not in the romanticized image of a tortured artist driven to suicide by his genius, but in the systematic psychological destruction of a human being by the very people and institutions that claim to help him. His death was not the inevitable result of mental illness, but the predictable outcome of medical negligence, family abandonment, and social rejection so complete that survival became impossible. Modern understanding of mental health makes Van Gogh's treatment read like a textbook example of how to destroy a human psyche. Every intervention, from Dr. Gachet's hands-off approach disguised as enlightened care to his family's calculated abandonment for financial convenience, represented a choice to prioritize personal comfort over human compassion. Van Gogh didn't die from mental illness. He died from the systematic cruelty of a society that had no place for people who didn't fit its narrow definitions of acceptable behavior. The paintings Van Gogh created during his final 70 days in Auvers-sur-Oise aren't masterpieces born from artistic inspiration, but documentary evidence of a mind under siege. Each canvas records another stage in his psychological dismantling, from the distorted perspectives that revealed his inability to process visual reality to the increasingly frantic brushwork that documented his growing desperation. We've been celebrating the wrong thing, not artistic triumph, but the visual record of systematic human destruction. Perhaps most disturbing is how little has changed in the century since Van Gogh's death. Mental illness remains stigmatized. Families still abandon members who become inconvenient burdens, and medical professionals sometimes prioritize their own interests over patient welfare. Van Gogh's story isn't just historical tragedy, but a warning about how society continues to destroy those who don't conform to its expectations of normal behavior. The bullet that killed Vincent van Gogh was fired not by his hand alone, but by every person who chose to look away when he needed help, every doctor who prioritized observation over intervention, every family member who found abandonment easier than acceptance. His death was a collective act of violence perpetrated by a society that had decided he was too difficult and expensive to allow to live. In the end, Van Gogh's greatest tragedy isn't that he died young, but that he died believing himself to be exactly what his tormentors claimed: a burden, a failure, a problem that could only be solved by his disappearance from their lives. The man who created unprecedented beauty from his suffering died convinced that his suffering was all he had ever been worth. This final victory of his tormentors over his spirit represents the true horror of his last days, not the death of the body, but the murder of hope itself.